أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Let me say that again. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh يا مؤمنين لعنة الله عليه المنافقين. So today we're talking about Hamza Yusuf's family system, his narcissistic family system, and the background, his background. And I'm trying to bring out certain aspects of his early life experience for you guys to see what I know, like for you to understand that there is a wisdom and reason why I'm so critical of traditionalist ulama in general, scholars in general, and the common kind of background features that all of these scholars have, right? A certain privilege and a certain narcissistic identity and a certain background, and how that informs their thinking, and how understanding a little bit about their early life experience, their family systems, you can understand who they are much better, and therefore you're able to contextualize what comes out of their mouth a lot better, right? And I think that's really important to too. I make a distinction between alim and scholar, and I also make a distinction between a moral human being and a narcissistic human being, and making the distinction and being very hyper aware that as the further we get from the time of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the closer we're getting to Dajjal, and therefore, the scholarship and the influential people in the Ummah, we have to be hypercritical of them. And if they're not open to being hyper criticized and having Islah of themselves being done continuously, and continuously receiving negative feedback and integrating it in a mature way, if they're not open to that, they should have no influence on the Ummah whatsoever. Okay, so specifically, and let me just contextualize this. There's so much to share with you, and so much to talk about regarding these topics, right? For example, I've disassociated Allah Bara from my Qabila, right? After establishing Hujjah over 30 years and suffering an immense amount of injustice, both myself and my mother, for 30 to 40 years, and not just me, other people in the family. Someone who doesn't deserve it was locked up in an insane asylum. A lady divorced one of my paternal uncles because she was being tortured the same way my mom was being tortured. It's just a zalim kabila, right? So there's so much, and so that kabila is directly the head of the patriarch of our tribe. His family, it has direct connections with Yasir Qadi, right? Direct connections with Yasir Qadi. And so I, due to my position and the position of my tribe, and having direct relationship with the set of people who are fairly influential in the Muslim American community, and knowing how sociopathic and psychopathic and hyper political they are, and having a deep understanding of these sorts of psychological dynamics, from a young age, just from observation, but then also through the Quran and the Sunnah, and establishing Hujjah, and then also by studying modern psychology, psychopathy, sociopathy, malignant narcissism, cult formation, double constitutions and social groups, corruption, all of these, studying common law, all this sort of stuff. Anyway, so there's a lot to talk about, right? So let me just quickly go over, to begin with, Yasukawa's early education and kind of his background, his parents, his wife, etc., stuff like that. The family system, the narcissistic family system that's status obsessed, that status obsessed, success driven, what I call conservative culture, or Eastern medieval culture, which is all about hierarchy and status driven, and wanting to attain a station. And then have you try to understand a little bit how that Hamza Yusuf's articulation and Arabic and kind of impressiveness is a perform as a performance artist, right? All those things he can do or procedural enactment, they're not substance, right? His ability to do like, and speak Arabic, like all, like that's beautiful that he can do that, but that's a performative ability. That is not a sign of substance, right? That is substance of iman is something different, and the procedural enactment ability to do that is something different. Now it can be argued that someone who has put the time into it must have some of the substance, but that's not necessarily true. And I just want you to understand that logically, that just because someone has spent a lot of time and intelligence and developed the ability to perform in the Arabic language that way, that performative capacity, uh, eloquence or Arabic fasat and balagat, or whatever it is, that is different from the substance of iman. That is distinct. There can be a person who doesn't speak a word of Arabic, well, not a word of Arabic, but that they still have iman, right? So I want you to appreciate that distinction, and from that lens, let's start going over some of his early formative experiences. So both of his parents are professors at Whitman College. I think it's in Washington or Northern California. He was raised a Catholic, and so Catholics are very much traditionalist and conservatives in the structure of the Catholic Church, in the structure of the organization itself. Um, and he went to I think prep school. One second. Yeah, so he attended prep schools. It says both on the East and West Coast, and that culture. And again, if you don't have personal relationships or personal connections or personal experiences with people who have attended such kind of like prep school culture, like these schools where you go off, it's like a boarding school, you go stay there, and then you form these bonds with other wealthy kids from around the country, and there's a certain culture of snootiness and narcissism, and you're kind of exceptional from the general population, and you get initiated into a certain status in society and a certain circle of people and interconnectivity, this sort of thing that happens. And if you don't know people like that directly, and I do know people like that directly and who I've had relationships with, there is a very there may be a facade of perfect personability and humility and humanness, and that facade that is so a real seeming of being very personable, there is a deep disassociation. The real character is always very mutakabbir, and it is always a superior. It always has a sense of superiority, and um, it's always seeking to control and govern and punish people who don't conform to that conservative sort of culture, or conserve, or anyone who doesn't recognize the superiority of the narcissist. They will seek to punish that person. So there's a face of humility. There's a face, and this is reinforced by Sufism. This is what tasawwuf is also, the pir murid thing is exactly this, where you have such a disassociation, where you have to be absolutely humbled before the peer, and then the peer is absolutely humbled before his own peer, and that chain of absolute dehumanization in relationship to one particular person then gives you the ability to be the fear of everybody else, right? So if you're perfectly dehumanized in relationship to one person, then you come out and you have the ability to start dehumanizing other people. Someone who's raised Catholic, has attended prep school culture. Both of his parents are professors, and in professors in liberal arts sort of fields, and so there's a certain person that goes into that, and they have a certain background, which we'll get into in a second. um, that person uh, who has that sort of psychology of dehumanization in the family system, where it's about a status, what status you achieve, where you go to school, how successful you are, how influential you are, how powerful you are in society, what your status is in society, right? Like how high you are in the conservative hierarchy, right? Because you have to understand, for a conservative, right, the traditionalist, it really doesn't matter whether you're a Catholic traditionalist or a Lutheran traditionalist or a Jewish traditionalist or a Muslim traditionalist. The deep structure traditionalism is nearly identical across all the religions, right? But the thing that traditionalism offers is that, the Hagia Sophia, or the great wonders of the world, like the Taj Mahal or something. And so it's the sense that beauty, the creation of beauty, and Hamza Yusuf talks about this, like architecture and civilization, right? The manifestation of beauty in civilization. But what that requires is that requires slave labor. It requires serfdom. It requires mass amounts of human suffering so that a few people can live in the beautiful castle and have the beautiful things. And for someone like Hamza Yusuf, that is conservatism, that is traditionalism, where that beauty is worth it's worth like people accepting a system, the creation, the final output of that beauty is worth the human population experiencing a mass amount of injustice and a mass amount of suffering and pain, so that the output of civilization can be superficially beautiful. Because the architecture might be beautiful, or the jewelry might be beautiful, or those few people who are kind of upheld, like Taylor Swift songs, right? Like the type of beauty she encapsulates in her music, that sort of idealized romanticism and that romantic beauty, she may actually get to experience it, but hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, or like even the show Friends that was popular, right? The experience that those six people are having, those six people to have that experience, and almost any television show, right? Like that's idealizing some sort of young sociability, uh, for those young people to have that experience, there have to be hundreds and millions of people who don't get to even have a simple, a satisfying relationship in their life, right? So that those few privileged people can just have this kind of indulgent abundance of socio-sexual experience, right? And the same thing for someone to live in the Taj Mahal or build the Taj Mahal for his lover, means that millions of people won't be able to have food for their kids, right? And so that's why modernity, for me, and this is where we're going to get into philosophy here, but this is why I believe like the American Revolution and modernity is actually a philosophical improvement over traditionalism, and that modernity is actually closer to the deen than is traditionalism, and traditionalism is actually fitna. A traditionalism is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ opposed and what the Quran opposes, and what was erased in the Hijaz by Nabi ﷺ. And Muawiyah Mardud, he began the whole thing again, because the king, once you have kings that cannot be questioned, and the Sunnis had the wrong fiqh where you can't challenge the king, and so this wrong fiqh that they made, that laid the foundation for a traditional society to re-emerge in the Muslim Ummah. right? To re-emerge in the Muslim Ummah. And so these sort of traditionalists like Hamza Yusuf, what they're doing is um, they're not going to return to the Quran, right? These type of traditionalists never return to the Quran. They never return to the Sunnah, as-Sunnah, not the small Sunan, right? The as-Sunnah, the whole Sunnah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They never holistically return to that life. And if you look at the Quran, it's talking to a present process that's dynamic, and there's a sort of expectation that the process is going to complete fairly soon. It's not trying to build an Islamic civilization over 1400 years. This is not what the Quran is doing. The Quran is trying to do iqamatud din, with immediacy and completeness and immediacy, right? There's an immediacy to it. So Islamic civilization, Andalus is not the ideal. Islamic civilization is not the maqsad or the purpose. The purpose is iqamatuddin, like happened in the Hijaz, right? That is the maqsad, that is the purpose. And people like Hamza Yusuf and even Yasir Qadhi, they don't want to return to the Quran and the text of the Quran and the coherent, methodological, rational, sound, perfect, unquestionable construction or self-clarification of the Quran itself, and then looking at the Sunnah in the light of the Quran. The Hadith has haja of the Quran. The Quran does not have haja of the Hadith, right? And especially, there's 2 points here that I want to make. Is that number one, the Quran is talking about ideas that are in our fitrah, right? Al asmaha kullaha is in our fitrah as Bani Adam, and so there's nothing that the Quran will talk about that our fitrah does not already intuitively understand. And so the classical question of how would we read Salah if we didn't have the Hadith? We don't know. The Quran it isn't that detailed, but it's telling us our fitrah already knows what Salah is. Our fitrah already knows what Salah is. And so there's a way in which the Quran doesn't have any, what it's saying is clear to us, to Bani Adam, right? We don't need anything other than the Quran. It is clear to us what it means. And all those tafsilat of whether you're going to have your hands like this, and or how are you going to do this, or it's going to be these tafsilat, yes, we get from the Sunnah, of course. We get this tafsilat from the Sunnah, but really the Quran is kafi, right? The Quran is sufficient. I'm not saying to ignore the Hadith. What I'm saying is the Quran doesn't have haja. It's speaking to our fitrah. The second thing is that the Quran is not a normal book. It is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So when you look at it constructs itself. So it's not like other books where like it's mahdud. It's not mahdud. If you know how to engage in the tadabbur of the Quran, it will answer any question. Right? Any tafsil, if you know how to do tadabbur, it will answer it. Right? It just, you don't have iman in the Quran being mubin anymore. That's the problem. The so-called scholars don't have iman in the Quran being mubin anymore. And so this is exactly this rabbinical softening through traditional. The rabbinical softening through tradition is exactly what the Yahud did. And so people like Hamza Yusuf and Yasir Qadhi are scholars, they're rabbis. They're rabbis, they're not imams, right? They're rabbis, they're not imams. And the deen has imamat, and has amriya, and has vilaya, and has molviyat, right? It doesn't have whatever these scholars have, right? That's not it. That's not leadership in the ummah, right? And we cannot attribute influence to people like this. And so Hamza Yusuf, people who refer to the tradition, and we have to go to Ghazali, and Ghazali is perfectly wrong. Ghazali is completely wrong, because the maqasid of the Sharia that he put forth, it's putting the human being at the center of the deen rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Before Ghazali, we understood that the maqsad of the deen is for the raza of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have to make mujahada to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we refer directly to the ayat of Allah. But this abstraction and taking out the five made up things that he thinks is the purpose, yes, Allah wants khair for us in the Sharia, that's true, but we're not supposed to act on it from that frame. We're supposed to act on it from the frame that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wanting us to establish the deen in worship of Him. And so we're not supposed to be understanding the deen through what benefits us. We're supposed to be understanding the deen through what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But people like Yasir Qadi, Hamza Yusuf, who refer to the tradition, and they think joining the tradition is what's important, which it's not. Referring back directly to the Quran and referring to the Quran through the living Ahlul Bayt, that is what is required. Right? That is what is required for the deen to be mukammal, and that is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in the Hadith al-Thaqalain. That is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in the Hadith al-Thaqalain. Now, again, going back to this prep school culture, I cannot emphasize it enough. If you don't understand, if you don't personally know people who have been through the prep school culture, and I have known multiple people of that kind, of that ilk, it is extreme two-facedness, it's extreme hypocrisy, it's extreme. They only show their true face to people of their own class, people who have the same amount of money, their old family friends. Only those people see the true face of these hypocrites, and with those people, they make fun of all the lowly people who circle around them, right? And in fact, this is pretty common, even amongst Pakistani families, right? Like the doctors who have all these orbiters in the Pakistani community, they have these, these big dawats, these big dinner parties where everyone is invited, right? And so there, oh, the doctors are so humble and they're so good and blah, blah, blah. But then they have those private dinner parties that everyone wants to get invited to, but only the doctors can go to, right? And or the people who are rich like the doctors, and that's where they make fun of all the orbiters, right? And so this is a dynamic of munafiqat, and people who are of the dunya, they have this dynamic where they have a two-facedness, they have munafiqat, right? And so these people who go to preparatory school, they're made to be people who people trust, but that trust is not, they're not worthy of that trust, right? So it's a pragmatic ability to elicit trust and reliance and influence from people and get people to do things for them, to be able to use people and throw them away. Basically, that ability to use people and throw them away. And Hamza Yusuf is from that type of culture. He is from that sort of family system, and he's from that sort of culture, right? And whether it's conscious or not, that's what conservatism is. That's what traditionalism is that it's a dehumanization of the experience of the poor, and like Nietzsche said, it's the opium of the masses. You give the masses the opium, or religion, tasawwuf, Sufism, Jannah will be like this, and Jannah will be like that, and you just talk about that and get people to the poor and the weak have to forgive, and the rich can sin, right? The poor and the weak have to forgive, but the rich can do sin and zulm. Right? So the rich can do sin and zulm. So this is the way of conservatism. It's the same in America. It's the same in Pakistan. Hamza Yusuf is the same. Donald Trump is the same. Right? Like, it's the conservatism. This is the nazam. This is the way people think. Right? This is the reality where the poor and the weak, their suffering is okay, as long as the system is maintained, and the rich can be rich, and they can enjoy their lives, and they can create the most beautiful lives possible, and we should just all watch them and worship them and just appreciate the beauty of their lives. This is what conservatism is, whether it's conscious or not. This is what it is, practically speaking, right? It's 90% of the population has extreme suffering, extreme pain, and they're given religion as an opium, and then 10 to 15% have these divinified lives, these almost like angelic lives. They're these unreal like godly lives where they're living on Mount Olympus. They have all the money, they have all the luxury, they have all the beautiful cars and the houses and the properties, and they have these infinite bank accounts, and they have all these insurance, yeah, and they have the, they create the most beautiful things, like, they live these like opulent lifestyles, right? And that is shown on television, and we're all supposed to appreciate the art and the beauty of these beautiful things from a distant, that nobody, and so that's not really sustainable, right? And modernity comes and says no, that's wrong, right? Everybody should have an ability to have, not that, overly indulgent whatever, but sufficient for their needs. And if they have a dream, they should be able to struggle to achieve it, and there should be social mobility. And so modernity is closer to the deen. And so, the mullah has made traditionalism the deen, but the mullah is wrong. The mullah is wrong. These so-called ulama are wrong. Traditionalism is jahiliyyah. Traditionalism is jahiliyyah, right? In its structure, well, you can put tawheed on it, and Ibn Taymiyyah, and you can say this is tawheed, and whatever, but it's still shirk. It's still taghut, right? It's still taghut. The nazm is taghut, like Saudi Arabia. The nazm is taghut, right? But jadidiyat, right, modernity, because it has musawat, it has equality between people, it is closer to the deen, because it's creating adal, it's creating qist, right? It's creating musawat between people. I'm not saying modernity is not an deen and riwayat is not an deen, right? So I'm not saying either one of these things are an deen, but what I'm saying is jadidiyat is closer to the deen, at least in some ways, in that hakuk of Bani Adam, right? The hakuk of Bani Adam and adalat and qist, at least idealistically speaking, at least modernity has this within it. Right? At least modernity has this within it, where tradition doesn't. No matter how much they idealize it or they talk about it, the traditional system and the traditional psychology and the traditional way of thinking is incapable of anything except producing systematic injustice. Traditionalism and conservatism can do nothing but produce systematic injustice. There's nothing else that it can possibly do but produce systematic injustice. Okay, so that's a little bit covering Hamza Yusuf's narcissistic family system, Hamza Yusuf's kind of background. Um, and his thought process and some of the realities of that. Anyways, I'll talk to you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.